again, we're living in an environment today where I'd argue that one of like the greatest competitive strengths a brand can have is like speed and agility. And generally I'd sort of say like the brand that learns the fastest wins. Because I think when you crack the formula for things that work, you start to compound those gains sooner. And things that don't work, then like stop doing them and move on to things that do. I think you want to be, as a leader or any role in a business, you want to be maniacally focused on like resource allocation.
Representing Franchise Secrets, Erik Von Horn.
Adam Ross, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
We were just talking about like, how do I introduce you? There's a number of different ways that I could introduce you on the pod. You've already been on, but you've been a friend of Front Street's. You are an operating partner in one of our consumer branded portfolio companies, and we're working on some other ones with you as a partner. So is that a good way to kind of talk about like how you're not just a friend of Front Street, but you are one of us?
Like to think so. Part of the gang.
Consumer branded, like explain what does that mean? Like talk about this bit of your mindset around like consumer branded companies.
Sure. I think for the most part, Erik, there's, with technology, with just, the way evolving the way it has, it's certainly become a lot more democratized from a cost perspective to start a business today, than a decade ago. So I think it's pretty noisy out there. So I think when I'm talking about, when we're talking about sort of like consumer brands, I think we live in a world today where clients, where customers, they increasingly see brands as an extension of themselves. So I think the emphasis and the DNA on where you have a brand that like resonates and has a connection and an emotive appeal to clients is one where you need to check all those boxes to sort of like rise above the noise of like this proliferation of brands and all these other things that exist in the category. I think 15 years ago, distribution and other things were seen as competitive advantages. Like that doesn't exist anymore. A lot of that has been democratized. So, you kind of like live and die by the strength of your brand. And I think the stronger the advocacy, the more attention you have, the higher the recurring revenue. And I think the more of a durable moat that you put around the brand and the business that I think sets you up for longer term outsized success.
We were just talking about a brand that we've been looking into. Not sure we're going to bring that one to market or not, but we were just talking about it and ways to increase revenue in that brand and bringing on certain people onto that brand that could add value. And so when we think about paying somebody, somebody having equity, we don't just see that as an expense, but how can they give value? So just around your mindset around that, because I think you have a way of thinking that's bigger than most people. That's different than a lot of, your average first time entrepreneur. So go back to that conversation. We don't have to give the details here, but just your mindset around looking at something as an opportunity for a revenue stream, an opportunity to create greater enterprise value versus just a very large expense.
Yeah. I think to build a scalable brand today, scalable brand and business, I would argue, Erik, it's increasingly to do that as one person. Like you need a team that comes together, that leverages their complementary skill sets where, the good old 1 + 1 = 3, 3 or more. So I think and maybe this, some of this comes with time and experience, but I'm always a proponent of, I'll have a smaller piece of a much larger pie. So I think when we're talking about, adding to the pie, when it talks about somebody coming on, I actually view it less as a cost and more as an investment. And you can frame it out through an ROI lens. If I am bringing this person on board, what's the expected impact we think this person will have? And then you can frame it that way. And, it's not always about the numbers, but I think when you get the right people around the table and you're doing it generally without egos, you should always ask the question, what sets this brand up for maximum impact and outsized success, or how do we de-risk the business, de-risk the growth and anything associated with it. So I think the more you do it through that lens, around sort of like accretion and adding value, again, sort of like a rising tide carries all ships.
All right. So let me know if you know who said this. I'm going to read this. If you're going to fail in a week, not in 3 months. That's the kind of clarity that comes from a true growth mindset. Did you say that? You probably did. I think that was you.
That me?
I think it was. I think it was you in a podcast somewhere. I'm not 100% sure, but let's talk about failure. And I don't know that you really like the term failure. I saw something about you saying something about reframing failure, but if you're going to fail in a week, not 3 months. That's the kind of clarity that comes from a true growth mindset. Let's pretend that wasn't you. What do you think about that statement?
I mean, I generally agree with it, and I think just some context behind that, Eric, where again we're living in an environment today where I'd argue that one of the greatest competitive strengths a brand can have is speed and agility. And generally I'd sort of say the brand that learns the fastest wins. Because I think when you crack the formula for things that work, you start to compound those gains sooner. And things that don't work, then stop doing them and move on to things that do. I think you want to be, as a leader or any role in a business, you want to be maniacally focused on resource allocation. And I think we're living in an environment today where clients want to give us feedback, and you're right. I don't like the term failure. I prefer validated learning. But again, I think why invest a lot of time, money, and resources on something until you have a sense of whether it's going to work or not. So generally, I think there's ways where you can get to an MVP version of something in a way where it may not be as elegant. It could be a little scrappier than what you may like, but customers want to give feedback to brands. So I think the sooner you can get a read on something, and if the feedback is positive, great, let's marshal the right resources and the right capital investment behind leaning into it. Those that don't, let's stop it. Let's move on to the next thing. So I think it's a way of just being respectful of resources and keeping everybody sort of focused and aligned on, sort of how to spend capital and, do it through the right lens.
So do you think as we talk about the mindset and specific, a growth mindset, do you see it more as a personal development thing, or do you see it more of a leadership framework? How would you kind of define it? Or maybe it's a mixture of both personal development and leadership framework.
I mean, I think it's, I think it's both. And I think at the end of the day, Eric, it's, can come down to different things for different people. I think a growth mindset, it's inherently an internal game that you wrestle with yourself, because I can't measure it quantitatively. And I think in a day, people love metrics, people love data. But at the end of the day, when you've got a growth mindset, you've got this curiosity, this openness, and this willingness to learn and grow and evolve. And I'd sort of say learning milestones can be very different from output milestones that come with specific business metrics. Again, I think leaders, we see different types of leaders, from those that I think truly have a growth mindset to those that are, sort of far more autocratic and this is the way it is and I'm right. The only time I was wrong is when I thought I made a mistake type mentality. But that's usually reflected in an org chart that's got people that are either too afraid to speak the truth, or yes, people that tell leaders what they want to hear, and that could work in the short term. It can have detrimental effects, like longer term. But again, I think it's so humbling leading and growing a business today. You're not going to create an enduring brand, I think, unless you're open to new ways of working, insight, feedback from other people, and how you learn and evolve, in your own way. So I think that's increasingly what I'd view as a must-have versus a nice-to-have.
All right, I'm gonna slow down a little bit because I came out firing questions right away. This podcast really came about because you and I were just talking about one of these future brands that we are looking at bringing into Front Street that you're involved with, and we were talking about that brand, and then we started talking about how you do coaching, how you coach founders, and is it mostly founders, C-level executives, or is it mostly founders? I think, Adam.
Yeah, it's mostly founders, but some CEOs as well.
So when you were talking about that, and you and I talked about that when we were in the Keys over at the Front Street meeting, and you and I were having our second cup of coffee that morning, which is a good cup of coffee over there, Cuban coffee. And you were talking about this, and it piqued my interest. And then we were talking about it again just the other day. And you said, before I bring on a coaching client, I'm going to spend time with them, on the phone call and on a Zoom meeting or Google Meet, and understand if they have a growth mindset. And I'm like, ooh, that would be good, because how many people really know if they have a growth mindset, or if their leader or somebody they're going to follow, or maybe, just understanding that growth mindset in general. They're bringing on somebody under their team and they need to know that they have a growth mindset. So that's really the genesis of this podcast, around growth mindset. So if you had to kind of define it, like what it really is and how it might get misused, what would you say? How would you kind of define it? And just dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I would define a growth mindset person, Erik, as someone that has the belief that intelligence, abilities, and talents can be developed through effort, learning, and perseverance. So for example, somebody with a growth mindset would be somebody that could say, I'm not good at public speaking yet, but I can get better with practice. And if I contrast that with somebody who has more of a fixed mindset, there's sort of this belief that intelligence, abilities, and talents are innate and unchangeable. So, a good example of that one could be, I'm just not a people person. I'll never be good at speaking in public. So you can sort of see two very different approaches. And, with the growth mindset, there is this, again, sort of like this inherent word growth, but it comes to, I think, sort of improving, learning, openness to opportunities, willing to listen to feedback. I think other traits that you certainly want to like tease out. So, one of the more commonly cited ones would be, like the success of other people. I think generally, if there's someone else that is hugely successful, somebody with a growth mindset is actually going to find that like really inspiring. Somebody with a fixed mindset is actually going to find that a bit more threatening. So, as you and I were talking, and, you're right, I do this call for an hour, and, it's obviously to sort of judge chemistry, but when you're in a coaching and a mentoring framework, as the coach and the mentor, it's all about, framing the right questions, and you want to be a mirror and a really sort of like honest and objective mirror for your clients, where I think, you can sort of call them out on their own narratives. And I think you can be quite provocative and thoughtful in the questions that you ask them that make them pause and go, huh, I hadn't thought about that. But the success and how that person evolves, like 70 to 80% of that comes from like the work that they need to do. I can't do the work for them. So if somebody is, I think, sort of like unwilling to feel that they can change and grow and get better, it's ultimately not a good use of their time or money, nor a good use of my time either. So I'd far, and for me, Eric, it's personally a lovely way to sort of give it back and pay it forward with a lot of my experiences um, with sort of like the clients that I work with. And there's nothing more gratifying than when you see this like light bulb moment go off, given the openness and curiosity and like where that can actually lead somebody to. And if I'm not going to get that, then again, I think life's too short to not do the right work with the right people. So that to my mind is an absolutely mandatory ingredient in terms of, some of the people that I look to work with.
I'm guessing growth-minded leaders, growth-minded people, growth-minded kids, like they can learn to be growth-minded. They weren't necessarily born with that. I'm sure I'm guessing it has to do with their environment that they were raised, or maybe it's just like who they are if they have that. But do you think it's something like that that comes from the environment that they were raised in? Not saying it was like a great or perfect environment, but maybe they had to think for themselves. They had to get out of different situations. Because I'm thinking about friends of mine who grew up in really hard environments, like really rough environments, and they
Yeah.
could choose two different
Yeah.
paths. One of my friends, his brother's in prison full time. Like it's his full time gig, prison for doing bad things. The other one is an extremely successful entrepreneur, great husband, great father, but he's a growth minded leader in his businesses, in his
Mm.
family, just in
Yeah.
general. So like,
Yeah.
give us the sense of like, you born with it? Can you learn it? Like, what do you think?
I think you can absolutely learn it. And I think that again, that's sort of inherent, Eric, in sort of like the growth mindset. Nothing is fixed, and there's always opportunities to, learn and grow. I think there's certainly a lot that can get informed at an early age based on the environment in which a child is raised, the interaction with parents. And I think some things via parents can be um could accelerate a few things earlier. So, one example would be, I think, when parents praise like the action and not the outcome, I would think that could actually sort of prompt a bit more of a growth mindset in children, sort of like implicitly early on. So it's less around, hey, Eric, you know, amazing, like you nailed it, you got 100% in your math exam. You're praising the outcome there versus, Eric, I was so proud of like how diligently like you studied and your willingness to like learn math and the effort that you put into that math quiz, right? It's very, very different. One's praising the outcome, one's praising the effort. So again, I think you can, and things like that can lead to, sort of persistence, lead to perseverance, lead to, openness and curiosity. But again, I firmly believe that all these things um, can be learnt. It's not fixed.
I'm in the thick of it right now with my kids. I was thinking,
Yeah.
you were saying that the other day. My wife and I, we were having a meal with the family, and yeah, I was telling one of my kids something, praising them for something, and then immediately the other two were like, "What about me? What about me? Like, where did I do good? Where was I amazing at this
Yeah.
thing that my sister was?" And we're like, oh no, like not everybody gets a trophy. Um,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and we don't like immediately. I'm like, that's the wrong thought that you should be having right now. Somebody else is getting praise. Somebody else is getting an award. Somebody else is doing really good at something. I want them to be able to like, give praise and understand that, like, instead of saying like, what about me, or get jealous, like, why don't you come alongside of mom and dad and tell them how proud you are of whatever the thing, or learn about the thing that they did that was really good. And I don't even remember what it was, but I do
Yeah.
remember, like, oh man, I do not want them, when somebody else gets praise, for them to be wanting praise themselves. I want them to be the person that sees that, is proud of them, and heaps on the praise, or starts to learn from the thing that they did. Am I doing
Yes.
the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing there?
No, I think you're doing the right thing, but again, I think it's the it's the nature of the praise. Because again, I can, as a you know just using my story, Eric, growing up, like my father would praise on accomplishment. He only cared about the end result. My mother would praise um on the effort, and that was actually a bit of a wrestle. So again, I think it's when you're praising on, I'd always just like come back to sort of praising on the effort, and that should promote the growth mindset a little earlier. So I'm so proud on the work you've done, and like the effort you've been putting into your school, or I see how diligently you're trying on blank, whatever it is. um the output is, you know it's a byproduct, but that shouldn't be the only thing that is celebrated, if
Good.
that makes
Nope.
sense.
I'm
Yeah.
doing, I had the same thought with that, with them. Even, they're going to their first taekwondo, like, competition. The two older ones are, and one of them is extremely competitive. All she cares about is a medal.
Mm,
And then the other one is like, I just want to have fun. So,
yeah.
but I'm proud
Yeah.
of both of them for doing something that, a few years ago they would have been afraid to do. And so I've seen
Yeah.
the growth in them, and that's really what I'm proud of. And that's the thing that, they've done the work, and that's what I'm proud of. And that's what I want them to see in themselves. I'm putting in the work, versus just a medal or no
Yeah.
medal, or whatever.
Attention, franchisors and franchisees. There are two really important resources that I want to share with you that will help you avoid costly mistakes and increase your enterprise value. The first is our free Facebook group. It's a community that has over 4,000 franchisees and franchisors in it. When somebody asks a question, they get honest and authentic answers from multiple perspectives. You can join the group for free over at franchisesecrets.com/Facebook. The second resource I want to share with you is, if you're a franchisee and you want to be around a community of successful Zs and other brands and in other industries, this is why I created the Franchisee Mastermind. If you want access to the best single and multi-unit owners to know what they're doing, or if you want to be around other multi-brand owners, then you'll want to check out my Franchisee Mastermind. The reason why people join is they want access to my Rolodex, my connections, to each other. They want a shortcut success, both short-term and long-term. Links will be in the show notes or at scalablefranchise.com.
Another thing, like,
Well, so I was going to say one other point, like the paradox with this is, again, I think some people with, like a fixed mindset, as an example, Eric, could say that, people with a growth mindset, it's a bit more of a softer approach, or, like they take criticism, they don't stand up for themselves. But I think to some extent, when you're more open and curious to learning, you're far more inclined to get into a flow state where I think inherently, like, your performance is actually going to be far more relaxed. You're going to be more in a state of flow, and you're actually going to get more outsized performance. You're going to actually get better results by actually sort of like, relaxing and opening up and sort of surrendering into things, versus I think what can come with a fixed mindset that's a bit more of, I must win, I must win, I must win. And again, I know I'm very competitive. I'm on the tennis court, and, you're thinking, sort of like, head down, racket in front of myself, and you got 7 different things in your mind. But I think if you're more, in a growth mindset, and you're in a bit more of a flow state, like things are just going to naturally feel less forced. You're going to be like less tense. So there's this, and I think it can feel counterintuitive of opening up and getting in a flow state where, we've all been there, and it's incredible, like the clarity, you can be quite prolific in your output. So it's one where you can actually unleash yourself in a far more, I think, powerful and effective way than this little bit of sort of like, my loss is your gain, and I am who I am type thing. Like you're almost going to be like your own worst enemy in terms of like holding yourself back.
All right, you said something that really triggered me. You're talking about tennis. And I would imagine that a lot of tennis players are closed-minded and a lot of pickleball players are growth-minded. I mean, that's just a fact out there. So when are you going to really drop tennis and pick up pickleball? That's the real question, Adam.
Well, I've in the true spirit of growth mindset, Eric, I had both pickleball and padel lessons last year. A lot of fun, like, lot of fun. I think it's just, very different dynamic. Somebody who's, grown up with tennis and was a bit more, sort of like competent and proficient in the sport, to go to something like pickleball where it's just not, it wasn't as, I sort of picked it up, but like obviously not like with the level of proficiency that comes with, like years of tennis and, getting run around the court by somebody half my age. But that's, putting yourself in these situations, it was, for me, there was no expectation around it. It was fun. I was open to learning. I had a great time, met a couple of people. Like that's exactly what this is about.
Oh man, that's perfect, Adam. Like that's, that is perfect, because it's really hard for like, a tennis player that it thinks they're way better than everybody else. Cause that's typically tennis players. They really look down on pickleball. So for you to humble yourself and come to the pickleball world for a little bit, that's a big thing.
I try. It's again, we've all had so many years, Eric, with the ego controlling the run of show. And, sometimes you've got to get that out of the way. Not always easy, but good to be mindful of it.
That was a good example, man. That really was. And I know that you're in an area where people, obviously if you grew up in tennis, but you're also in an area that like most people play tennis there. They don't play pickleball. So that was a good example. All right. But you also brought up something, I wrote in here as you were talking, I'm like, growth-minded leaders are probably not easily offended. Would you think that's true? Or how do they handle offense? Are they okay having tough conversations? Somebody says something that they disagree with, like how does a closed-minded versus growth-minded person handle conflict, handle, something that might be where somebody with a closed mind might take offense to something? Like what's the dynamic? What's the difference between the two types of people?
I think someone that's a little more of a fixed mindset, Eric, would, probably sort of like dismiss a different point of view, and that could be done sort of like quickly, or it could be done a little more, combatively or like adversarially. It probably just like depends on like the persona of the, of the leader in question. But it could be, a little more of I'm right, you're wrong. Or this is the way it is, or like, you don't know what you're talking about. So, it could be sort of like demoralizing to the employee in question. I think, a growth-minded leader, on the other hand, would see different data, and it could be, okay, tell me more, like share more with me. And then, that gets into a discussion. I know when, I think you just, in your question, there's a little more, do I get offended easily? I think at the end of the day, it's just like, if the greater good is around like growing the brand, it's all about having the right people in the right room to, to challenge it and present opportunities that others aren't seeing. I know when, people have made comments about me in the past, I can get upset about it, or usually deflect it with, if you knew a lot more about me, you'd be saying a whole lot worse, right? Just take the sting out of take the sting out of the accusation and move on. I think around, I'd like to think this would happen irrespective of sort of like growth and fixed mindset people, but in my experience, it's not the case. I think a lot of people talk about, air quotes, difficult conversations. I think, and again, that's a word I don't necessarily like. I'm a fan of using the word authentic. And I think if it's not about the character of the person, and it's an objective comment that is rooted in authenticity, compassion, kindness, like yet directness, then I think it's very, it can be hard for the other person to, to receive the feedback, but it's not going to be, they're not going to be upset. I think where conversations can go awry is where some of these things can feel more like a personal character attack. Yeah.
As you're talking, and you and I work with brands and are always trying to understand if some of these leaders and these brands that we're looking at bringing on have that growth minded, if they're that growth minded leader. But as you're talking, I'm seeing stuff in my everyday life, and I think everyone listening, whether they're a franchise buyer, franchisee, work for a franchise, or they're a leader, they're probably seeing stuff in their personal life. Like, I was on a text thread this week, and this has nothing to do with business. This is a personal text thread, and someone in the text thread said something, and they're like, "I'm being helpful. I am, I'm going to do this thing because I'm being helpful." And I'm like, "Wait a second." And I was leading this thing, and I'm like, that's not helpful. But they probably do think it is helpful. They're doing it from a place of like, they're thinking it's helpful. It's really not helpful. And I need to know if you really want to do this thing that we're talking about doing. So I followed up. This is not helpful. That's the directness. But we really do want you involved in this thing. So let me know if you want to be involved in this thing or not. And then I sent a message to kind of the leader of this thing. And I said, check my response. My desire is to be direct and kind. And that's like really what I sent this person. And they responded back, "It looks like you accomplished what you were trying to accomplish." So they said I was direct and kind, but that in my mind, I wanted to be direct and kind. And you just said that, a couple minutes ago. So like in real life, like, I'm like, it's direct because it was the truth, and it was done out of a place of kindness, and I didn't have any emotion about it, but that was my goal. Is that an example, like in everyday life, of like what a growth minded person of directness and kindness? And then how would you kind of bring directness and kindness into the business world?
Yeah, I think it's a great example, and I'd put a finer point on it, Eric. I think there's a difference between being nice and being kind.
Okay.
And I think kindness is, as you just illustrated there, is when you speak the truth. I think when you try and be nice, you try to kind of like go along with the flow and not give the feedback that needs to be given. So you don't want to, offend anybody in the moment, but you're ultimately doing that person a disservice. I think with a growth mindset, you're bringing your true authentic self. You want to sort of share that and give that feedback in how you show up with others. So, I found where I, as a general rule that I go by personally, and I think sometimes where I fall short of it, it's less in the it's less in what I say, is probably more in like where I may need to give a bit more context behind the reasoning and set it up where the person just has a bit more perspective. Because I think sometimes we all like internalize things, but only a portion of that is what we communicate to a person. So if I'm giving feedback to somebody, at a particular company around why let's just say I don't agree with like their suggestion. I could say, a fixed mindset would be, that's wrong. That's not right. We're going to do it my way. And a growth mindset person would say, I'm coming at it differently, right? And I want to just give you some context behind my solution, and I'm doing this, just to sort of like level up. We're doing this because we all want what is best for the brand and what's like right for outsized success. And right, here are the filters with which I'm making the decision. So you ground it in sort of like the objective behind what you're doing versus a sort of a he said, she said, or anything sort of like character trait related. So you make it a bit more objective versus personal. But then again, back to the, our earlier conversation on praising the effort versus the outcome, it can be, but I really appreciate the effort and the initiative around like you thinking through ways to improve and blah, blah, blah. Like keep doing that. So again, I think it's all in the, and this is where so many things just get like lost in translation. It just comes down to not necessarily communicating the why.
So let me translate to everyone what Adam just did. He's like, Eric, you were 50% right, but you weren't 100% right on that. This is what you could have done better. And Adam is right. I left out a little bit of context. I didn't say this isn't helpful and then leave it at that. I did give a little bit more. So because behind the scenes, what you don't know is we're working on X, Y, and Z. And that's why, and this is why I want to know this from you. And then I said, we really want you involved in this thing. What I didn't do was that last piece that you mentioned. And so I didn't do it like fully right. So I learned a little bit here, but I'm 75% of the way there. So, am I right in the fact that you're like, hey, Eric, you did a pretty good there, but you could have done even better. Am I right with that?
You are, but you then demonstrated a growth mindset in your observation around that and your willingness to take that feedback on board and implicitly improve that for next time. Again, a person with a fixed mindset, Eric, would have said, yeah, like whatever.
I remember, I don't remember a whole lot about what I learned in college. But I do remember we were assigned to read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen A. Covey, I think it was. And I probably read that 4 or 5 times, in my life. And there's one statement: seek to understand versus be understood. And I think that probably demonstrates a growth mindset. Because some of the things that you were talking about earlier, another personal situation that I was in, I was talking with somebody and they're like, this thing is not going to work. And this is somebody, that I'm really close to. They're like, this thing's not going to work. Then they said that just after I gave them a possible solution. And I gave them a solution to this thing that I was going to be actively involved with. And I was going to actually lose some money by doing this thing for them. Yeah. And I said, I'm going to email my CPA and ask them about, if I could do this thing. And they're like, no, it won't work because they said it wouldn't work. And this was 2 years ago. Situations were very different. And I knew that this thing could work. And they just said, no. And I said, I think no, it won't work. And I'm like, wait a second, I'm dealing with a closed mindset here. They are seeking to be understood versus to understand. And so I'm just going to drop it behind the scenes, I'm still going to pursue this thing to help them. And it's just to help them. It's not going to help me at all, but I really care about this person. So behind the scenes, I'm working to help them, and I can, like, the thing that I thought I could do, I can do, and I will do it. And I have no desire to go back to that conversation to say, I told you so. It's just like, I'm seeking to understand versus be understood. So is that another example of that? That's somebody with a closed mind. And I think it's just and this is probably an important distinction. In that moment, they had they were closed-minded versus growth-minded, because you can be closed-minded and growth-minded in different situations at different times, I'm guessing, because it's not like just because you're growth-minded, it doesn't mean you're always that way. So that was my takeaway from that. Like, ooh, I think I'm growth-minded in a lot of situations, but there's probably situations today that I am closed-minded. I don't have a growth mindset, and I want to make sure that I'm more growth-minded and I'm always growing in that versus like just closing things off. What do you think?
I totally agree. I mean, it's never as binary and black and white as what we're talking about. There's numerous shades of gray. I mean, I think with any of this stuff around a growth mindset, Eric, it's just generally all about how we intentional and how we mindful around this, and just try and get a little bit better every day. And there's fits and starts, and we're not always our best. We're not always our best self. I think on the situation that you just mentioned, I've done this like with my teams over the years. It can be quite interesting around, let's just say, like a new strategic initiative or something where there's some good discussion. I actually get some like role playing on the person that is generally sort of supporting the case, and the naysayers, and you sort of let them hash it out, and then you say, okay, like, reverse the roles. I want you now to advocate for the exact opposite position. See how they react, right? Like, it actually, and again, like, some people, it's like, oh shit, like, I've actually now got to think fundamentally differently. And some people can embrace that and some can't. But again, like, these are very interesting and fun, like, teachable moments where I think you also understand, a bit more about your team members.
I love that. I remember doing that in debate in high school. I was I was on the debate team, and you had to do that. You had an issue, and you had to know that issue from both sides, not just one side. So shout out to Bob
red team,
Sears for
blue
teaching
team,
me debate.
Have some fun. Yeah.
What are signals that someone's stuck in fixed thinking?
I think that there's a few telltale signs, Eric. I think one, probably sort of at the highest level to generalize would be one of sort of like defensiveness that comes with a bit more of a fixed mindset versus openness that would come with a growth mindset. I think how people respond to failure. So again, like, if someone with a growth mindset would usually treat failure as data, and like the insight and the opportunity that could come from it. I think somebody with more of a fixed mindset, it's just viewed more as it's either like sort of denial or blame. But again, I think just the core of themes on evolution and growth and improving is what we want to see with sort of like those with the growth, with the growth mindset. So I think, how you handle feedback, how people view challenges, that can be, and that, again, that's part of what I like to tease out when I'm working with people or looking to work with people. Again, in terms of their, how broad are they willing to open their aperture? And that's, so I'd say at the highest level, there's some like generalized buckets that I look to sort of like ask questions and, see what I can learn.
So let's take this. Is there, in a little bit different direction, is there any correlation between a visionary and an integrator or operator having a growth mindset or fixed mindset? Is it visionaries that have growth mindsets, or is it operators or integrators, or like is there any correlation with that?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think visionaries generally are more predisposed to having a growth mindset because, by nature, Eric, if they're a visionary, they're looking to introduce something that is newer and fundamentally better than anything out there, with the status quo today. So, they're looking to improve and make a difference in presumably a new and better way. I think in my experience working with operators, I've come across those that have, got sort of like a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. There's not necessarily a one size, fits all. I think some of that can come from, and again, I'm sort of going to like generalize here, but if you've got someone that has, maybe come from like a larger organization and they've been there for a period of time, it could be one where if that organization is a bit more around sort of like, SOPs and different, rules and standards and sort of like processes, that doesn't necessarily mean they've got a fixed mindset, but it's one for me where I'm like, they come from an environment where that could be a bit more of like the inertia within the organization. So like, let me learn to see if this person, is different there or not. Someone could come from like a Google or another company that, again, large and, institutional in some respect, but, very, very sort of like growth, sort of growth oriented. So I think it's, again, like there's no necessarily sort of like one size fits all. And I think we've all, again, sort of inherent in my own journey and growth mindset is, I think you've got to, you don't judge a book by the cover. You've got to meet, you've got to talk, you've got to ask questions, and you've got to, you'll start to get a sense whether somebody falls into like one of those two buckets.
All right. So I've got two more questions and then some follow-ups, but we're nearing the end. So a fixed-minded person will be listening to this podcast. And so think about a fixed-minded person in your mind will listen to this podcast and say what to themselves. And the same thing for a growth-minded podcast, or a growth-minded person will listen to this podcast and be saying what to themselves.
A fixed mindset person has probably shut this podcast off already, Eric. So we're sitting at this stage of the discussion. they've dismissed anything I said. I think, a growth mindset person here. I mean, my hope is there's been a couple of comments where that sort of prompted a bit more of, hey, I think maybe there's, are there any more areas in my life, or can I be more open to growing and improving, and other opportunities to learn? Am I making sure I'm soliciting, more sources of feedback from my team? They're the thoughts that should be going through their mind right now.
So
how can I use some of this and take it away to get better?
So let's say we have a growth-minded person. They made it through the end, and you have a fixed-minded person, and they actually made it to the end, because we're probably going to use that first part, what you said about the fixed-minded person won't make it to the end. That'll probably be the teaser. So there'll be some fixed-minded people that are here right now listening to the end. Where should they go, any of them, to be more growth minded, wherever they are in their journey today, whether they're super fixed minded or they're very growth minded? And I like to think of myself as growth minded, but I'm always wanting to improve. Where do they go to learn more? Are there books, or their podcasts, or there certain people that you think like, oh, this person's really growth minded, follow them? And maybe that's like a Richard Branson or an Elon Musk or somebody like that, or just like a podcast or a book or somewhere that they could go to be more growth minded.
Yeah, I think there's, I think there's a number of, I think, sort of takeaways. I know there's there's actually a great book by Carol Dweck, Erik, called Mindset. It came out, 15-ish years ago. There's also a great Harvard Business Review article on sort of like how to help people shift from a fixed to a growth mindset. They could be a little sort of like drier in terms of some of the literature, but I thought the Carol Dweck book was outstanding. I think we've got there's some very interesting podcasts. Shane Parrish at Farnham Street, Tim Ferriss, Founders Podcast, ways where it's all about, I think, being more open, curious, and, opening yourself up to new possibilities. And I think for those that are in leadership positions today, it can also just come from where you actually open yourself up to colleagues and those around you, around asking questions on where they think they see opportunities for you to improve, or, ask better questions on, I want you to tell me more about this area of the business, or, what parts of the business do you feel I need to be paying more attention to so we can have a, strategic discussion around it, that sort of thing. And, get feedback from your team. I think there's certainly a lack of psychological safety in a number of companies, because I think some team members that are closer to the client, closer to the problems, you want to create the space for them to sort of share. So again, everyone can brainstorm on, solving one problem to then move on to the next problem. So I think there's multiple ways that people can act on this immediately.
Well, I wasn't even thinking about Tim Ferriss, but absolutely. As you said that, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a perfect example. And the book is Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. I would check that out.
Yeah.
Adam, thanks again for coming on, and we bring your pickleball paddle. If you don't have one, I'll buy you one, an old wooden one. I'll buy you, and so you won't be able to beat me up as a new player, and I'm someone that plays all the time. So I'll buy you a cheap wooden paddle, and then we could go have some fun on the pickleball course in the Keys next time. Sound good?
Look forward to it.
Thanks for coming on.
No, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Franchise Secrets podcast. Links to everything can be found over at franchisesecrets.com. And if you want my help with anything from starting your own franchise to growing your current franchise business, please visit scalablefranchise.com.